I'm hoping that now that we are starting promptly at 11 o'clock, that we'll be able to achieve the objectives of the day. We'll be able to go through all that we have set out to do. This is, for me, a very exciting event. When we and policymakers in the same room trying to figure out how to ensure that the lives of the people become better. I read one of the interviews that Professor Abayomi gave a couple of years ago, in which he said, Africa is the hotbed for infectious diseases. And I'm very happy that Africans have come together to try and find solutions to their issues and to try to take to the world the capacities that abound within the continent. So, without further ado, I would like to invite the co-chair of the conference, Professor Morenike Upong, my long-lost sister. I'm so happy to find her here today to give the welcome address on behalf of the co-chair, Professor Alan Christophels, who is unable to join us. Please put your hands together as I welcome this powerful woman to the mic. All right. Before I do that, I understand that the representative of the DG of the National Biosafety Management Agency, Mrs. Bello Scholastica, is here. Could you please wave for recognition? Where are you? Mrs. Scholastica, we are happy to have you. Do we have? Okay. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. All right.
Thanks, Pumi. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure on behalf of Alan and myself, who's been planning and working with a large team of other conference committee members to welcome every person here to this conference. We welcome you to the 5th African Conference on Emerging Infectious Disease and Biosecurity. And as you're aware, our theme for this conference is Climate Change and Conflict, Implications for Emerging Infectious Disease and Biosecurity. The first conference held in Senegal, and our second conference held in Lagos, the third held in Ghana, and the fourth held in Sierra Leone, and this is our 5th. And as you would imagine, we've been moving around West Africa, second time in Nigeria, and hopefully, as we move to our 6th, we will be moving to other parts of Africa in line with our dreams, hopefully. But since the 4th conference, which held in Freetown, Sierra Leone, the intervening months has continued to witness the devastating consequences of infectious disease transmission. And I'm sure many of us are aware of what's happened in Democratic Republic of Congo and the Ebola crisis that's there, and the continued impact of fear, including the closure of Rwanda borders, albeit for 2 days, and the consequences of such closure to financial, personal life, as well as development. So understanding and responding to infectious disease transmission dynamics require collective efforts and exploiting the wealth of technology advances at our disposal to help make a change in the system. We also at GET are very aware that beyond technology, we need to fast-track a number of things. One of the things we look forward to fast-tracking is public education and awareness in ways that makes public education programs cross-cutting in nature, so that we address not only the biology, but we also address behavior and structural responses. We have to do a lot more than also be conference attendants. We have to translate knowledge to plans, and we have to see those plans also translate to action. And it is with great joy to note one or two of such transforming processes, which was part of that bathed during the dream, following the first conference, and was built on with the second and third. And it's my pleasure to announce, and I'm sure we'll be hearing at this conference, the success story of the Lagos Biobank, as well as the Biobank in Sierra Leone. We also would like to hear about other bats of ideas, programs as a result of this conference, and we would on that note, we would like to invite every single participant here to share such thoughts, such bats, and such events with us through our GET newsletter. Our GET newsletter is accessible on the GET website. You can see a sample, and please note that the contact addresses are there and all contributions are most welcome. As the conference theme highlights, the relationship between climate change and shifting infectious disease transmission patterns cannot be ignored. We need to continue investigating this complex relationship so that we can effectively predict future disease outbreaks, but not only predict, but also take prompt responses to mitigate the impact. I trust that this conference will give the space for such rigorous debate as well as personal growth. In addition, the discourse on specimen and data sharing for the public good is gaining momentum in Africa and should continue during this conference as we reflect and deliberate on how best to strengthen Africans' public health emergency response capacity. And please note, it's not only the sole responsibility of any government to do this. So as conference participants, we would like to hear from you in future about how you've translated this understanding into making changes within your own environment. I trust that you will enjoy the conference, you'll enjoy the talk, you'll enjoy the discourse. You'll also find an opportunity to explore Abuja. We would also want to learn about the new friendship you make with participants here, as well as new research opportunities. On that note, once again, I would like to say welcome on behalf of Alan and myself. Do have a great meeting.
Thank you. That was the co-chair of the organizing committee. I would like to recognize another keynote speaker, Dr. Nahid Badelia. She's here. So, okay, please put your hands together for her. Welcome to Abuja. Welcome to the conference. The DG Nigerian Copyright Commission, Mr. John Asen, just stepped in. Please, where are you, sir, Mr. John? Please put your hands together.
Is where I was born and where I come from. But we gracefully surrendered Lagos as the capital of Nigeria, and it moved to Abuja, which is a central location. And Abuja is now the executive capital of Nigeria. But Lagos remains the commercial capital of the great country of Nigeria. We're here, and I have two roles to play in this on the podium this morning. We were expecting the Great Honorable Minister of Health for Zimbabwe, Dr. Obadiah Moyo, but unfortunately last night he called to say that he has been assigned by the President of Zimbabwe to a mission, and so he had to abort his trip to Abuja. But he promised that he would definitely grace the 6th conference of GET, and he's one of the senior members and founding members of this consortium. So we are going to miss him on this occasion, but he did give me some of the points that he wanted me to raise, and so I've built it into my presentation. And so I'm going to give you a combined presentation of why we are here, what GET is all about, and what the continent of Africa needs to do moving forward in terms of biosecurity. So thank you very much to Professor Mpong for giving us that introduction. Morenike, another senior member of GET. We were expecting Professor Alan Christoffels, but he's on a flight at the moment and he will join us shortly. And he comes from the South African Institute of Bioinformatics, and he's also the chair of the conference organizing committee. I see many of my colleagues from Lagos State, so thank you for gracing the occasion, and many of my colleagues from across ECOWAS and WAHO, the West African Health Authority, and from Ghana, from Sierra Leone, and our European colleagues who have graced this occasion, and some of the dignitaries that have joined, and the Ameo Foundation. So let me proceed. Next slide, please. Can I change? Yes. Thank you very much. So this is Dr. Obadiah Moyo, who has sent his humble apologies, and he has promised that without fail he'll be at the next meeting. And as you know, ministers can be called at any point in time, so he couldn't. He had his tickets and everything booked, but he couldn't make it. So we want to think a little bit about the future of biosecurity on the continent of Africa. And so we see that the graphs show, and this shows the incidence of emerging infectious diseases in Africa seems to be on the rise. And something has happened in the last 10 to 15 years that is giving us this sharp peak, and this is an exponential trend. We're not sure whether this is just simply the fact that we're recognizing things a bit more, or whether this is a true reflection of what's going on. But however the case may be, this is a worrying trend. And we know from this graph that the equatorial region of Africa, which is where we are right now, which spreads across West Africa into Central Africa and East Africa, seems to be the epicenter of emerging infectious diseases in the world. So we have a lot of concerns in this environment, and we need to be alert. We need to be astute. Otherwise, we will be taken by these events. And historically, we know what happens when we have a major outbreak of pathogens of high consequence. And the West African Ebola outbreak showed us, and definitely was an eye-opener. And what's going on in the DRC at the moment is also a reflection of things to come. And then there is this underlying prevailing threat of antimicrobial resistance, which is to do basically with how we use antibiotics in our environment and the generation of multi-drug resistance to the bugs, by the bugs, to the complement of antibiotics that we use. And this is becoming a very significant issue for us. And we've experienced that in Nigeria, and we continue to experience it. We had a recent outbreak of multiple entropathic drug-resistant pathogens in Lagos, in a popular girls' boarding school, which was as a result of the manner in which we use antibiotics in our environment. So we're very cognizant that antimicrobial resistance is emerging to be one of the major biosecurity threats on the continent. Now, the WHO has the sole responsibility for declaring a FAKE. And a FAKE stands for a public health emergency of international concern. And we know that in the last 10 years, we've had 4 fake declarations. The swine flu of 2009, the polio outbreak of 2014, the West African Ebola outbreak of 2014, the Zika outbreak of 2016, and now we have the next fake, which is the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that was declared by the WHO about 2 weeks ago, which has set a lot of machinery, international global response machineries, into gear, because it has suddenly taken on the probability of being a threat to neighboring countries and a threat to the global community. So the WHO, in their wisdom, have decided to declare the Democratic Republic of Congo Ebola outbreak the 5th fake in the last 10 years. And you can see from the figures that the trajectory is not subsiding. And we're going to hear a little bit more about the DRC outbreak during this conference, and we have some people that have actually returned from the DRC who will be in a better position to tell us why we are experiencing this unrelenting trajectory. And there are multiple reasons for that. And we'll have the opportunity during this outbreak to understand what's going on in the DRC, despite the fact that we have available to us some potentially very effective vaccines. We're still seeing this trajectory. If we didn't have those vaccines, where would this trajectory be right now? So we're going to hear all about that during the course of this conference. So this slide is just to help us prepare for what's going to happen in the next 20, 40 years. And it shows the trajectory of the population, the demographic population of Africa. And this is where we are right now. We're 2020 about. And we have about 1 billion people in Africa. But in another 40 years, we're going to be in the region of 3 to 4 billion people on the continent of Africa. And when you compare that with what's going on in the rest of the world, and this blue line here is Europe, you can see that there is a stark contrast to what is going to happen over the next half of this century. Europe is going to remain, by modeling, relatively stable, but Africa is going to demonstrate an exponential rise in population. What does that mean? It means that our cities, in the next 20 years, Africa is going to be a continent of megacities. And there is a huge rural to urban migration going on the continent. So that population increase will be significantly felt as megacities, the evolution of megacities. And megacities have major health issues, what we call the megacity biosecurity threat scenarios. Let's just run through some of these. What is the quality of the inner city and the rural spaces in Nigeria and across the continent? What is it going to look like? This thing is very sensitive, sorry. So this is what a planned urban city should look like. An expanding city, you should have nice lanes and greenery, and the rural communities should be a combination of rural mixed farming with maintenance of ecosystems, forests and patches. So there should be an organized expansion and an organized use, land use, and urban city planning. But most African cities are not experiencing this. There's this massive influx from the rural communities. We're not taking this into consideration. These people that are moving into the cities are having to live in slum environments. And these are the kind, this is not peculiar to Nigeria by any means. This is a trend across the continent. And these are the kind of populations that we're going to see in these mega cities. And these kinds of populations come with issues. They come with human pressure considerations. They come with pressure on the environment. They come with issues about toxicity. And everybody is using chemicals and using substances that are not particularly good for the environment. And so these kind of human pressures are going to put a tremendous pressure on our ecosystems. Many African cities have a major slum health issue. We have problems with waste management, and we have problems with water, quality of water. As you can see, whatever you do on the surface of the earth is reflected in your water table. Sometimes we just think it's okay to just throw things into the environment and they will decay in the environment. Well, yes, they do, but they percolate into our water systems, and it is those water tables that we draw on for our daily need and water supplies. And we have experienced this in the megacities of Nigeria and across the continent, that our water supply is becoming toxic. And it is polluted with chemicals, heavy metals, and pathogens that are highly dangerous to the population. Now, we used to have lush forests in Africa, and heavy logging is taking a toll on our forests. And this is the kind of environment, this used to be an environment that was full of lovely, huge forested biomes. And as you can see, there is desolation. And that gives rise to unproductivity and an imbalance in the ecosystem. So, something is wrong with this thing. Let us now examine the biosecurity threat that was handled in West Africa. Before, later on in the conference, we'll hear about what's going on in the DRC. So a number of children were playing on a border town in Guinea, bordering with Sierra Leone and Liberia. And what were they doing? They were looking for protein to supplement their diet, and they were hunting bats. And I'm not sure if these lights can be taken off this screen. They were hunting bats, and lo and behold, one of those children became sick with an unknown febrile illness, soon died. And in these rural communities, we're accustomed to sick patients not being seen by conventional doctors, but by being seen by traditional healers. And these traditional healers are the main source of health support to our rural communities. Of course, they're not equipped, number one, with the diagnostic skills or the management skills to deal with pathogens of high consequence. And so these traditional healers were themselves infected, and before we knew it, a sequence of contact between the sick and caregivers produced an exponentially and rapidly expanding outbreak. And this is the WHO schemata of how that outbreak evolved in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, which lasted almost 3 years caused tremendous human suffering and death, and the collapse of major economies in that part of West Africa and across the continent. It finally died down at the end of 2015 when we were able to take a breath of relief. But before that happened, there was a devastating toll. But this slide shows you that there was a period of about 20 weeks in West Africa when Ebola was sort of grumbling along. 20 weeks. And we were not able to, number one, recognize what it was, and number two, bring it to an end. If we had taken some action around here, then this would have been the sum total of the West African outbreak. But we didn't recognize it. It came up, it subsided, and then there were some enablers that ensured that this outbreak went out of control. Now, what were the reasons why these three countries in West Africa were devastated by Ebola? Human resource is always a big issue in Africa. Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea are some of the poorest countries on the continent. The epicenter of the outbreak was in a very remote location, where I said that the mainstay of help would have been traditional healers. We hadn't heard of Ebola in West Africa prior to this event, so it was new. It was the last thing we were expecting. Of course, we had inexperienced staff in handling pathogens of high consequence. And very importantly, we didn't have the infrastructure to diagnose and to manage patients with a dangerous infection such as Ebola, which is a category A pathogen, and it belongs to the category of pathogens that cause the most havoc during an outbreak. This was the kind of scenario that we saw in those countries. Makeshift treatment units in the open. These are the kind of chaos that we saw. People were dying in the public. This is the kind of very basic infrastructure that we have. Very simple primary healthcare units in remote settings. And then eventually, after about a year, we started to see a well-developed treatment unit structure evolving in the three countries. And for those of you that are familiar with what a treatment unit looks like, ideally, a patient that is suspected of Ebola will come into what we call the low probability ward. If the clinical scenario suggests that you are clinically looking like you have Ebola, then you'll be moved to a high probability ward so that there is no chance of you, if you have Ebola, contaminating the other people in that facility. And then a test will be done, and if you're positive, you move into the Ebola ward. And at any of these points, if you recover or you're found to be negative for Ebola, you would be removed from the facility. And in this facility, if you are confirmed Ebola on arrival, then you go straight into this facility, which is the Ebola ward. And there's only two ways out of here. You either survive or you perish. And if you perish, you're moved to the mortuary or the crematorium. And this facility is heavily guarded, and visitors are able to come in, but they can see their patients from a distance. No contact is allowed, and the doctors and nurses that are providing the care have their entry in this area, where they gown up to go into these wards to deliver health care. So this is the type of facility that we need to set up across the continent of Africa. Since we're beginning to see these kinds of events happening on a more and more frequent basis. We need to be able to put this kind of thing together very quickly, or have permanent structures that will remain intact should in case we have an outbreak. So, at the end of the day, in the West African outbreak, we had 11,000 deaths, 14,000 survivors. It affected 10 countries, and it crippled the economy. But more importantly, we lost many of our colleagues. Our healthcare professionals, who are the front line of an outbreak, were not prepared adequately enough. They didn't know how to encounter Ebola. And so in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, there was a heavy toll on the healthcare providers of these countries. Countries that already struggle with manpower in terms of healthcare. And it was devastating. 180 healthcare workers died in Liberia, 221 died in Sierra Leone, and 94 died in the Guinea, Conakry. Then something dramatic happened. An index case flew out of Liberia and arrived in Lagos and started the mini outbreak in Lagos. Thankfully, we were able to bring that outbreak under rapid control. Otherwise, it would have been a devastating scenario. And thanks to the bravery of some of our colleagues in Lagos, who were very astute to recognize what was going on and were quick to recognize that this was most likely a case of Ebola, and Dr. Stella Ameyo Adadevo was the chief clinician who recognized that this was a case of Ebola, but by that stage, some people had already been infected, including herself and Dr. Ada, who were the attending physicians amongst others. And while we were trying to bring the outbreak under control in Lagos, these very brave clinicians were already infected with Ebola. Unfortunately, we lost Dr. Ameyo, but Dr. Ada lived to tell the horrific experience of being an Ebola victim and an Ebola survivor. Incidentally, at the time, the Honorable Commissioner of Health, Dr. Jide Idris, who will be joining us tomorrow, started to explore, because there was no treatment, there are no vaccines, there is no drug that is effective against Ebola. And we had a sick colleague in the Ebola unit. And we started to explore the possibility. At that point, Dr. Ada was beginning to recover. And Dr. Adadevo was getting very sick. And we started to explore the option of using blood from Dr. Ada to treat Dr. Adadevo. And that was the beginning of a very complex operation that started in Lagos. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it. We couldn't do anything to save Dr. Adadevo. But something interesting happened. Now, had the outbreak taken hold of Lagos, the large population density in Lagos City and Nigeria would have caused a starburst effect across the world. So we're very lucky that the surveillance network, the contact tracing, and the astuteness of the Ministry of Health and the Federal Ministry of Health of Lagos and the Federal Ministry of Health of Nigeria were able to bring the Nigerian outbreak under rapid control. Otherwise, we would have seen a global spread. Now, Dr. Idris, the Commissioner of Health for Lagos State at the time, recognized that there was something seriously wrong on the continent of Africa. Being the #1 medical executive of Lagos State, with a rapidly, potentially lethal outbreak happening in his city, without any means of responding to this outbreak? First of all, we didn't have the infrastructure to diagnose it. We didn't have the infrastructure to keep the patients. We had no medication against this pathogen, and there was no vaccine. So he recognized that something serious was going on. And as a result of the fear and the panic that gripped Lagos, an organization was born called the Global Emerging Pathogens Treatment Consortium, which decided to get itself together. It was a consortium of African healthcare professionals, logisticians, lawyers, ethicists, engineers, anybody that would be relevant in the response to a major outbreak, rallied around the call for Africa to empower itself to address this seemingly paralytic state that we found ourselves in. So this was the initial collection of people that joined the GET consortium. And there you can see the picture of Obadiah Moyo, the Minister of Health for Zimbabwe, and many of our colleagues who are present in this room today came together to form this consortium so that we could work with the international agencies to demonstrate an African response. Now, the first thing we thought about doing, because at that point there were many survivors in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. And survivors have survived because they have an intrinsic ability to overcome this virus. Those that died, obviously, they were unable to fight this virus, but those that survived, there is something in their blood that would be useful to us. Since we didn't have a vaccine and we didn't have any known medication, what could we do to respond to this outbreak? So we reached out to global philanthropists like the Bill Gates Foundation, and they donated millions and millions of dollars of equipment, and we were able to rally around through massive community engagement, and this was all triggered by Dr. Ameyo Adadevo's sickness and our initial attempt to take blood from a survivor to treat one of our senior colleagues. So we rallied around. At that time, we didn't know that the Lagos outbreak was going to come under control, and we were anticipating that this was going to escalate out of proportion. And so we thought we could get survivors, thousands of survivors in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, to harvest their blood and fly that blood into Lagos, or at least use it in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea to bring their outbreak under control. So this is an example of the community engagement. All these people were just early survivors of Ebola. And members of GET, you can see GET members in the group here. And majority of these people have just recently been discharged from an Ebola unit, and this was in Sierra Leone. And these are some of the staff. We had t-shirts made, Stop Ebola. This is a survivor. This is a volunteer. This is another survivor, and this is Ada. So we went into the field and were able to harvest blood from survivors. And this is what, sorry. This is the white blood that we put into freezers, and this is what it looks like. Everybody has red and white blood. And it is in the white blood that the antibodies live. And the antibodies are what fight infection. So inside this white blood would be the antibodies against Ebola from the survivors. So if we could harvest this from a survivor, we could give it to a new patient and hopefully help them recover from the Ebola. So we did many projects. So that was one of the things we did. The other thing we did was there were numerous samples of Ebola all over West Africa that we had to bring under control. And these are this is Sierra Leone, and during their outbreak there were thousands and thousands of Ebola samples, which was creating a biosecurity threat. So the GET consortium was able to go into the field and rescue these samples. Doctor? Can you control the... So able to go into the field and rescue these samples from thousands of miles apart and bring them, next slide please, bring them into what we considered to be a temporary holding center that had security, next slide. And then we also managed to get the data that was associated with these samples and put them into a specially designed database which has all the reference points for the outbreak in Sierra Leone and Lagos, Nigeria. Next slide. This was the type of environment that our colleagues were working in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. And you can see these are makeshift facilities, totally unacceptable. This was how many of our colleagues were infected with Ebola and got sick. And if you look at, next slide, if you look inside that freezer, I was able to just walk into this facility, open a freezer, and the red bottle there is labeled positive Ebola samples. Thank you. I thought I was speaking for Dr. Moyo as well. So I have more time. Already? Oh, okay. Time flies. All right, next slide. So when you look at the developed world, you have 1,356 BSL facilities, which is a specially designed facility for containing pathogens of high consequence in the United States. Now remember, I told you that the epicenter of emerging infectious diseases is Africa. So when you look at Africa, you can see that there are only about 3 functional BSL facilities across West Africa: Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria. And I think there's one in Senegal as well. And then you look at the rest of the world and you see that there is an increasing number of BSL facilities. So one of the things we needed to do was to develop BSL facilities in West Africa. Next slide, please. And this is what a BSL looks like. Next slide. And this is the only BSL-4, which is based in South Africa, a very sophisticated facility. Next slide. So we set apart to develop a BSL facility in Lagos and Sierra Leone, and this is the map of the Lagos mainland hospital. Next slide. And through the collaboration with the Canadian government and the Ministry of Health of Lagos State and Sierra Leone, we're able to design a BSL facility. Next slide. Next slide. And eventually, the next slide, you can see this BSL facility that was donated by the Canadian government, which represents the ability of Lagos State and Sierra Leone to respond to an outbreak in those environments. Next slide. So we've done a lot of work on governance, sample sharing during outbreaks and during routine public health scenarios, including data. Next slide. We're working on LIMS infrastructure, how to manage the inventory of samples and data during an outbreak. Next slide. Next slide. And we're also working on the ability to share African DNA from the continent, next slide, to collaborators around the world. This requires a very delicate amount of governance and collaboration on access, benefit sharing, and compliance, which at the moment, Africa seems to be a policy-free zone where people can come in and take African DNA and data without much regulation. Next slide. So you're at the 5th conference. Prior to this, we've had the conference in Dakar, in Lagos, in Accra, in Freetown, and now we're in Abuja. Next slide, please. This was a conference in Dakar. Yes. Next slide. Keep going. This was in Lagos. That was the Lagos conference. And we've managed to reach out across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, where GET has been instrumental in setting up the Center for Biosecurity Studies at the University of the West Indies in Barbados, and that was launched in 2018. Next slide. So, why are we here? In the next 2 minutes, I'm going to tell you that we're going to talk about climate change and the multipliers of conflict and regional tension. We're going to talk about this throughout this conference. Next slide. In Nigeria specifically, the slide there shows that the Sahara Desert is migrating progressively southward, and that is putting pressure on food security, water, movement of animals, availability of pasture, conflicts, and insecurity. And wherever you have conflict and insecurity, there's always the opportunity for a biosecurity threat. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the One Health paradigm. What is the ecology of One Health? We as human beings live in the ecosystem. We're not outside of the ecosystem. And the One Health paradigm is beginning to recognize this. And we as biosecurity practitioners have to propagate this message. Next slide. Keep going. So the pressure on water is tremendous. Lake Chad is drying up. Lake Chad was a source of livelihood to 50 million people in 4 countries, Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. And that is putting a tremendous pressure on the source of livelihood for people that live around that water table, which, as we know, is creating some political tensions. Next slide. Keep going. So the other major issue is deforestation. We have experts here on forest management. Next slide. And what we've been doing is sustainable deforestation, which is putting huge exponential pressure on top of global climate change. When we are destroying the environment, then we know that we are compounding the effect of climate change. Next slide. So the forests, as we know, are the lungs of the earth. And if we remove them, then we're only depleting ourselves of the opportunity for fresh air and carbon sequestration. So my last few slides, these are some of the members of the GET consortium in the field in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. And those are my affiliations at the Nigerian Institute of Medical Research, Lagos State Ministry of Health, the GET consortium, H3 Africa, and Stellenbosch University. And my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Professor Abayomi. Please put your hands together one more time. I think he did a fantastic job of illuminating, he gave a very illuminating presentation. And I must also say that he exhausted every minute, every second allocated to him, but not one, more. Please put your hands together for him again. Thank you for setting the tone for the conference. Now we know why we're here. We know what the issues are. We know the past conferences. How did they go? What were they about? So I'm not going to summarize what he said. We all heard him. In this room, we have participants from 10 countries spread over 4 continents. I think that is no mean feat, and I would like to say kudos to the organizers for pulling all the experts together in this room. Thank you so much. We have the next keynote speaker. But before I go to that, I would like to tell you a little about Professor Aki Abayomi for those who do not know him. He's a professor of medicine and health services at Stellenbosch University in Cape Town, South Africa. And he drew from his experience working on the Ebola outbreak to demonstrate how global health issues can be examined not only from a medical perspective, but also a political and historical one. Is the principal investigator for Global Emerging Pathogens Treatment Consortium, GET, which was formed at the height of the Ebola outbreak in 2014 to help combat and control the spread of the disease. GET aims at addressing ongoing and emerging biosecurity threats through research and by strengthening states' technical capacities, which he demonstrated during his presentation. It is with great pleasure that I introduce also the next speaker. He is Dr. Rufus Ebegba, the Director General Chief Executive Officer of the National Biosafety Management Agency. He holds a BSc Agriculture, MSc Environmental Biology, and a PhD in Biodiversity. Dr. Ebegba was involved in the development of the Nigerian National Biotechnology Policy, the Nigerian National Biosafety Framework, Biosafety Policy, under the UNEP GEF development of the National Biosafety Framework Project. The Nigeria National Biosafety Risk Assessment Analysis Framework, the Nigeria National Biosafety Application Management Guidelines, the Draft National Biosafety Regulations, the National Biosafety Containment Guidelines, the National Biosafety Communication Strategy, and the last edition of the Nigeria Biosafety Guidelines, to name a few. Unfortunately, he's unable to join us this morning due to other engagements of state, but he has asked a powerful woman in his agency to represent him and speak on his behalf. She is Mrs. Bello Scholastica, the head Planning, Research and Statistics Department of the National Biosafety Management Agency. Please put your hands together as we welcome Mrs. Bello. You have 20 minutes, and so that we'll have 10 minutes for questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. When I went through the list of presenters, I saw that they were mainly professors and doctors, except one. And I was scared and worried. To top it, when Dr. Abayami made his presentations, he scared me with details of EIDs. So as I am here delivering this speech on behalf of my DG, I'm just wondering if I will be able. On behalf of my DG, I want to apologize for his inability to be here. He was recently appointed as the chair of the African Biosafety Forum. He is the first DG of biosafety in Nigeria, the first in West Africa, and as it stands now, the first in Africa. He will be speaking on a tool for mitigating the effects of climate change and conflicts. The nexus between climate change, conflict, and infectious diseases. Professor Abayami has done a lot about that. Unless I forgot, Professor Abayami, I met you in Egypt, if you remember. And I'm not too sure if you were this fair. I'm thinking maybe it's a climate change thing. You can see the nexus there. Climate change leads to infectious diseases, as he has discussed, scarce resources, conflict. I don't have to go through that again. Okay, next slide. It's still all about what he has discussed. Mitigating the effects of climate change, some approaches, you have various approaches, and some of them are listed here. You have modern biotechnology, streamlined communications, they're all listed. But then I'll be focusing on modern biotechnology, which is what we regulate. It is one of the reliable tools for mitigating the effects of climate change. How? Because modern biotechnology, that's not the slide, okay. You have the production of nutrient-enriched food, such as golden rice, maize, potatoes, and soya beans, which reduces malnutrition. We have said that climate change leads to malnutrition. And then through biotechnology, we're able to develop crops that can mitigate this malnutrition. You control environmental pollution through biodegradation of potential pollutants. And of course, reduction in carbon dioxide emission, which plays a great role in stilling the change of climate. You also have it offers medical devices for diagnostic and preventing purposes, such as the one you have for diabetic patients. It offers new medical approaches for interventions of emerging diseases caused by climate change. Health, life quality, and expectancy have been increased worldwide through the services provided by biotechnology. Despite the great potentials this technology offers, there are issues, there are concerns, and these are some of the concerns that are listed: gene flow, invasiveness, and all that. Thus, there was need to bring about something that will ensure that these concerns are addressed. Thus, the birth of biosafety, which according to the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, refers to the need to protect human health and the environment from the possible adverse effects of the products of modern biotechnology, while FAO explains that it is safe and environmental sustainable use of all biological products and applications for human health, biodiversity, and environmental sustainability in support of improved global food security and livelihood. Now, biosafety, therefore, is the application of laws, policies, regulation, everything under the head that you think about for mitigating the potential risks that modern biotechnology and GMO might pose to you, the environment, and whatever. MBME was started in Nigeria in 2015 through an act of the National Assembly. Its mandate is to provide regulatory framework, institutional and administrative mechanism for safety measures in the application of modern biotechnology with a view to preventing any adverse effect like I have stated. The mission is to promote the basic tenets of biosafety as enshrined in the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety and enforce Nigerian National Biosafety Management Agencies Act. Mr. Biosafety, what do you have to offer in this regard? Safety in the practice of modern biotechnology and dealing on GMOs. The importance of biosafety. They are put in place to protect biodiversity and avoid adverse effects resulting from the practice of modern biotechnology and the use of their products thereof. They are based on 2 international agreements, which are the CBD, I'm sure all of you are very conversant with that, and the CPB. And the CPB requires that all member states develop national administrative and legal frameworks as a way of domesticating the protocol. Nigeria is signatory to these 2 agreements. That's how it evolved in Nigeria. It all started from 1994 in the Federal Ministry of Agric, where stakeholders from various MDAs, non-governmental organizations, associations, and all that gathered to develop a biosafety guideline that even preceded the Cartagena Protocol. Down to 2015, when eventually a bill was presented and assented to by the president. The latest we have, about last week or thereabout, a few days ago, Mr. President assented to the enlargement of the MBMA Act to accommodate the regulation of emerging aspects of modern biotechnology, such as gene drive, gene editing, synthetic biology, and biosecurity. So these areas are now being regulated by MBMA in Nigeria. And what does that mean? Functions of MBMA: formulate policies concerning biosafety, carry out biosafety risk assessment, ensure safety, like I have said, dictate and analyze GMOs, monitor and enforce compliance, and then we build capacity. Above all, we register, permit, inspect, and enforce biosafety tenants. Places MBMA regulates: commercial farms, research institutes and labs, confined field trials, GM multi-locational farms, GM crops and products companies, GM food processing manufacturing companies, and all that. Events that are under the purview of MBMA: containment facilities, confined facilities, multi-locational trials, on-farm demonstration, general releases, everything as it were that has to do with modern biotechnology and GMOs. Stages. Right from when experiment starts in the lab, MBMA comes in and regulates. Check the facilities you're about to use. Are they okay? Are they up to the standard? Or are you going to end up with, there's this novel, I can't remember now, where the gentleman worked in the lab, tried to create somebody, eventually created a monster that chased him. I don't know, he hated the monster and the monster hated him so much. I don't know how many of you have read that novel. Yeah? Frankenstein is very good. So to prevent something like that, we start to regulate from the lab. Greenhouse, confined field trial, food safety assessment, and general release. Biosafety is assessed at every stage, and it takes at least 13 years for any GMO product to be approved for commercial release. MBMA strength. We have the capacity, we have what it takes, but we are not yet there. And this is what we have on ground. Proper positioning and mainstreaming of the agency into the national administrative structure. I hope that is not part of my 20 minutes. Okay. Can I use this while that is? While they are working on that? Can I? Should I continue? Or I should wait? Okay. We have biosafety operational and implementary instruments, regulators as guidelines. Just like I said, we have the policy, we have the regulations, we have the guidelines and all that. We have vibrant and robust capacity building programs, synergy among stakeholders for effective regulation, public engagement and enlightenment programs, effective communication channels, and biosafety lab with state-of-the-art equipment. These are some of the regulatory instruments that we have: Biosafety Policy, Act, Guideline, National Biosafety Manuals, National GM Detection Lab and Analysis. And of course, we have the NBC, National Biosafety Committee. They normally will sit to review all applications. And for the National Biosafety Committee and National Biosafety Technical Committee, resource persons are drawn from all fields that is related to the crop or animal that is being evaluated for approval or rejection. Biosafety authorization. Section 22 of the Act specifies that no person, institution, or body shall import, export, transit, or deal on GMO without the prior approval of NBMA in Nigeria, including now, from last week or this week now, the practice of gene drive, biosecurity, synthetic biology. So please, let's be aware of this. Condition for biosafety authorization in Nigeria: formal application, payment of requisite fees, risk assessment and risk management plan, socioeconomic consideration. Types of biosafety permits. Like I said, we start all the way from the lab: accreditation of institutions and certification of confinement facilities, permit for confined field trial, permit for general release, permit for import and export, licenses for processed food, licenses for dealing with GMO, registration of GMO events. Biosafety decisions so far made. We've made a lot of approvals, or a few approvals if you like, depending on the context you are coming from. We have 6 institutions that have been accredited to practice modern biotechnology in Nigeria. Any institution outside this that is practicing modern biotechnology is doing that. I shouldn't complete it. Next. Approved confined field trials in Nigeria. African biofortified sorghum for bioavailability of iron, zinc, protein, and probe vitamin A. GM cassava resistant to cassava mosaic virus and brown stake virus at National Root Crops Research Institute. GM rice modified for nutrition use efficiency, water use efficiency, and salt tolerance. All that, a whole lot of lists. Mainly cassava, maize, sorghum. Then you have for general and commercial release: BT, insect-resistant cotton, and cowpea, modified for resistance against Morocco insect pests. Permit for importation, mainly on maize and soya beans, to various companies. Then consequence of all regulated practice of modern biotechnology and use of GMOs. Well, you can say, okay, why regulate? If you don't regulate, these are the likely things that may happen: possibility of misapplication, serious threat to national security, lack of confidence in the sector, brain drain and brain decay among our scientists, dumping ground for unregulated GMOs. Whether you regulate or not, GMO will come in, especially if you do not regulate. So you regulate and you are sure of the things that are coming in. Loss of revenue, as farmers may smuggle in unregulated GM seeds. Inability to guarantee purity of agricultural products. No wonder then some of our products are being rejected at international markets. Loss of sovereignty rights of protecting our biological resources. Lack of protection from our farmers and farming system. Apprehension among the among the populace on the socio-economic consequence of the sector. Synergy among stakeholders for effective regulation. We have, like I said, we have what it takes, but we're trying to build all it takes. And for us to be able to achieve all it takes, we synergize with all relevant stakeholders, such as ministries, departments, and agencies, university research institutes, foreign developmental partners, non-governmental organizations, media, National Assembly, law enforcement agencies. So far, we have signed MOU with these MDAs, National Variety Release Committee, National Seed Agricultural Council, NAFDAC, and all that. Who next? What next, MBMA? We are still signing more. We are ready to collaborate. For the universities, we have so far collaborated with these 4 in the areas of National Biosafety Conference. These conferences are taken to their university. They co-sponsor the conference. Their students actively participate in it, and it is a way of disseminating information on biosafety. In fact, at our last conference, we had 3 universities vying to be the next hosts. And eventually, Federal University of Technology, Akure, took the day. Now, there's a call for biosafety experts. For more information, you could check our website. And from the profile that I saw, or I read, the handout that you gave us, I'm sure a whole lot of you are very much, you have all it takes to let us have a better biosafety system. As a region, Africa is characterized by the greatest infectious disease burden and overall the weakest public health infrastructure among all regions in the world, re-emphasizing what Dr. Abayami said. Obviously, climate change has brought about tremendously disturbing effects. There is urgent need for all regions to work together in this global fight against climate change and work towards carrying out an holistic approach towards mitigating against the outcome of these changes. On our part, MBMA ensures that only GMOs brought into the market are those that are safe as their conventional counterparts. The government of Nigeria, through the MBMA, has put in place world-class systems to protect the interests of Nigerians and the environment in the application of modern biotechnology, which is a panacea for climate change and combating emerging infectious diseases. This is very obvious. And finally, has provided an enabling environment for indigenous and foreign scientists to practice modern biotechnology safely under a robust legal framework. Thank you. You can contact us via these addresses.
Thank you, Madam, for sharing the work of the National Biosafety Management Agency with the participants at this conference, as well as your challenges and your successes. I'm sure that in the next 3 days, I hope that you have somebody from your agency participating at this conference so that you can benefit from the knowledge, the wealth of experience and knowledge of the researchers in the room. So, do we have questions? Do we have comments? Okay, yes, ma'am. Okay, how many hands? 1, 2, 3. Nobody from the side. Okay, they're fine.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm Dr. Rosemary Audu from Nigerian Institute of Medical Research. I heard something, I need to be corrected. You said that organizations that are licensed to do work on modern biotechnology, it's like you have a list of about 4 or 5 institutions in Nigeria that are licensed to do modern biotechnology work. What's the criteria? How did you get about that? Because we're a research institute, we have a department of molecular biology and biotechnology. We've been doing that since not now. So how did that come about? And it doesn't look like it's well known. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So we'll take the 3 questions and then you can respond.
I am Dr. Ephraim Ogbaini, Institute of Lassa Fever Research and Control. It was specialist teaching hospital here in Nigeria. First is to thank the presenter and appreciate the work of the National Biosafety Management Agency for all they have been doing. The area I want to comment on, because when the presentation started, I was curious because biosecurity, biosafety, I know there is the pathogen aspect of it, especially in the human medical health department. My concept of biosecurity goes beyond food and biotechnology. It attains microbes, pathogens specifically, in terms of their containment within the country. So I'll try to ask, because I didn't see that in your mandate, and I didn't see any organization that you are collaborating with in terms of that aspect. If this is totally out of your mandate, are you interfacing with any other agencies in this aspect of biosafety? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My comment is similar to the one of the second speaker, because I was following the presentation very closely, and there are a lot of biosecurity issues that are on now in the area of the pathogen he has mentioned. If you listen to the presentation of Professor Abayomi, the area of specimens being taken away, the area of biological transfer agreements and co, which has to do with biosecurity, the aspect of containment laboratory as it affects the human pathogen that we have, the issue of biobanking, and the issue of biosecurity. So it's very, very important. Those ones are not there. So I will go to his own line, that what is the level of collaboration of the agencies with institutions that are carrying out this activity. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Let me start from number 2 and number 3, because they're very much similar. Gaps are meant to be filled. If you listen very attentively, before last week, our focus was on just modern biotechnology, excluding biosecurity, excluding gene editing, excluding synthetic biology. But with the presidential assent to these other areas, then instruments, collaborations, and all it takes to ensure safety of Nigeria and the environment shall be developed, and all necessary things put in place For now, as I speak, they are not there. But with the assent of the bill by the president, all what you have asked will start immediately. Yeah, very soon. And if you recall, I said we were established in 2015. Between 2015 to now is just 4 years. If you look at what we've achieved, it's marvelous. I'm not trying to sing our praises. Then for Dr. Rose, she said she saw just six institutions that are licensed to practice modern biotechnology. If you listen very attentively, Doc, I did say that our act says that no institution, nobody, no organization is permitted to deal or practice modern biotechnology without approval from the agency. And I outlined the processes. I said you apply. If you apply, you pay the requisite fees. After that, risk assessment is carried out. And then your approval is rejected or accepted depending on if you are qualified, depending on what you present. So please, if you have not keyed in, it's an opportunity for you. And that is why in forum like this, we'll always bring up this issue so that all of us will be bio-safe in what we eat, our environment, etc. Thank you.
new emerging infections, and we have to really think together how we can deal with these. But I like this basic principle, and sometimes it's important to go back to the basics, and I'll tell you why it's important for us in Nigeria. These are the three basic constructs that we deal with when we think about infectious diseases. The interaction between hosts, the agent, and the environment. And the closer these are together, the more likely you are to have a transmission event. It sounds very simple, but if you think about it, the environment can change to some extent. We're talking about climate change today. But what can't change is the size of the environment. Our geography is fixed. And what happens is the more people live in a geography, the more likely you are of having a transmission event. You don't have to think too long about that. And now, something nobody talks about in many infectious disease conferences is that Nigeria is going at a rate of 2.8% per annum. Now, if you really think about it, it's a scary statistic. And anyone working on infectious disease will have a lot of work to do for many, many, many years to come if we don't deal with this. And dealing with it is outside my control. So I can only deal with the effects of that, the impact of that. But I worry about my colleagues. I see them from Lagos State. Because if you hear Nigeria is growing at 2.8 per annum, states like Lagos, you have to, in addition, deal with all the internal migration from all across the country into those states. So with our climatic conditions, our population growth rate, the fixed geography, we are faced with a challenge because there's no other place in the world, almost, where the conditions are better for the transmission of infectious diseases than around the tropics with a growing population rate. This is a very basic principle. So if you're working in the area, you'll have a lot of work to do. If you're scared about the consequences, we will need to push for the political change that has to drive the areas that we cannot affect ourselves. So, like I already alluded to, in Nigeria, there's a lot of, the population is growing, but again, apart from the population growing, there's a lot of internal and external migration. We tend to skim over behavioral change challenges because nobody really wants to talk about these hard issues. We had a big issue last year about drug use. We banned a few things and made a little bit of noise, but the underlying issues that are driving those things are not being addressed. And addressing those things are almost impossible to do from a health sector side. We have to really involve the whole of society to deal with kids that are out of school. Why are they out of school? And when they're out of school, they use drugs. And then when they use drugs, they're more likely to carry out risky sexual behavior. And when they carry out risky sexual behavior, they get HIV. And then it becomes a health issue. But you can see the beginning of the trajectory has almost nothing to do with health. And therefore, the interventions that we have from the health sector are really not going to stop the problem. We really have to think a lot deeper. And so the responsibility for all of us, whether you're in politics or out of politics, or in government or out of government, is really to raise your voices around these issues of poverty, inequality that affect and have an impact on diseases like cholera and tuberculosis. Every time NCDC responds to a cholera outbreak, it's the most painful outbreak that I have to respond to. Because, what am I going to do for a cholera outbreak? I put people in a small treatment center. We get partners around to treat them. But, cholera, this is 2018-19. We shouldn't be having cases of cholera. There was a time that supplying water, clean water, was top of the political agenda in our country, but it's no longer anymore. So whenever I have the opportunities to meet governors of the Federal Republic, I tell them, Your Excellency, I can't be coming to your state to manage outbreaks of cholera. Call me when it's Lassa or monkeypox or something that is new and for which we don't have the tools. But for cholera, we know what to do. So there's a real challenge for us in terms of how we can focus our resources on the things that matter. The environment, this is another big area. You can all see the impacts. If for someone that's just visited Nigeria and just come to Abuja and gone through the Great Highway now that runs from the airport, might not see the real impact of the environmental conditions around the country and the impact it has on health. Technology and industry is another big area that is fairly unregulated in Nigeria, and we're challenged in terms of how to deal with the impact of that on health. Last year, we investigated a small cluster of botulism that really challenged us in many ways, but these things are happening in our context as well. And then the agents, and then I'll go into a bit of examples of some of the agents that we've had to deal with in Nigeria and the impact it's had on our work and on the environment. But there is a lot happening, which is why I'll go into the needs of a public health institute. The traditional tools that we have of surveillance and laboratories just for diagnosis will not be enough if we're going to really deal with understanding the interaction between host, agent, and environment that we need to do in order to really confront the challenges and be ahead of the game in terms of how we can respond to the challenges that face us. So now going into some of the challenges we've had over the last 3 years. Anyone that wants to work or is working on infectious diseases always has his hands full in Nigeria, because these are just some of the big ones that we've faced, from the Ebola outbreak that are so well handled by some of the colleagues in the room right now, to the re-emergence of polio. 2 weeks after my appointment in 2016, just at the verge, probably at the same point we were now, 3 years ago, we found 3 cases of wild polio virus in Borno. Since then, colleagues at the National Primary Healthcare Development Agency, who lead the response, have worked very hard to again get us to the verge of elimination. But now a consequence of that and poor coverage for routine immunization has led to the increase in circulating vaccine-derived wild polio virus. So there's another challenge brewing. And to a mother with a paralyzed child, she really doesn't want to know whether that paralysis is caused by a wild polio virus or another type of polio virus. So we do have a communication challenge ahead of us when we get to elimination by the end of August, actually, this year. So we've had to face that, a large meningitis outbreak 3 years ago, and those that understand how meningitis cycles happen, this is the 3rd year. We're looking towards next year, and the serogroup that caused that outbreak, we don't have a vaccine, or we have a vaccine commercially available, but it costs $50 per shot, so we don't have access to it in Nigeria. So we really have to step up our detection and response, especially next January next year. Lassa continues to be a threat, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail. So I'll think a little bit with you around the first case study I want to share with you. Now, these are the cases of Lassa. These are trends over from 2016, 17, 18, and 19. And you can see the increase of cases every year consistently within the first 3 years of the 3 months of the year. So this is not your normal outbreak as it's defined for us, that has a beginning and an end, and then you respond and you leave. So Lassa is really endemic in our country. There's an endemic epidemic phase, but cases continue to happen throughout the year. And we've gotten now a very sophisticated surveillance architecture, from beginning detection to confirmation to Lassa. And we probably know up to the home of every single confirmed case of Lassa. So for no other disease have we developed a more advanced surveillance infrastructure, thanks to so many people across the states and local governments, labs, IRUA, Specialist Center. I've seen one of our colleagues here. So for Lassa, we really have developed a deep understanding of the disease. And with that, we hope to gain even more in terms of what is driving this. When the big outbreak in 2017 happened, there were so many questions. thrown to all of us at the time. What is happening? Is there a change in the host? Is there a change in the agent? Is there a change in the environment? Going back to those three basic principles. And we didn't have the answers initially. But we started doing a lot of work with partners to understand both the agent, the environment, what is driving transmission, and trying to learn a little bit more about transmission dynamics. And we've continued to do this on an ongoing basis, and I'll share some of our initial findings. But this is just, again, a distribution of Lassa in Nigeria in 2018 and 19. So we've always said most of our cases have come from three states, the Ondo, Edo axis around here, and the Ebonyi axis around here. But we've seen kind of a southwest to northeast trajectory. But what has happened last year is we've started seeing and detecting cases in the northwest axis, quite a number of cases in Kebbi. So with that, it's not easy to understand what is going on. Why are we seeing these new cases? Is it that are we creating these outbreaks by increasing the sensitivity of our surveillance? So are we detecting something that probably was in the environment all this time, but as you look harder, you develop your lab capacity, your surveillance capacity, are we finding more cases because of that? Or is there really something happening in the environment that is leading to increased contact between rodents and humans? So these are questions, and the answers are not completely clear, but these are important scientific questions that someone then has to do research in order to answer. So, we have to think, how are we going to organize ourselves between academia, national public health institutes, state governments, local government researchers, partners, in order to answer these questions, because nobody can really do it on its own. So some of the things we found from the work we've done, when I say we, it involves a lot of partners. This is not just NCDC, both academic partners in Nigerian universities, but as well as partners in Germany, Harvard, and a few other places. So in 2018, we did, with other partners, some real-time sequencing, and found that really there were no new clades of this vaccine circulating. So the type of the virus circulating. So the type of virus was exactly what had been detected in Nigeria in previous years. So at least on the agent side, I could go back to my minister and other people that were asking, saying, sir, the virus itself hasn't changed. So something else is changing. At least we can exclude that component as much as we can understand the virus and say, we know that the virus has not changed. So we must look at other reasons. We're now seeing a much larger outbreak than we've seen previously. And the most likely explanation, the conclusion of those studies at the time, was increase in spillover events, so increase in transmission from rodents, rats, to humans. But we still have to find out why are rats having more contacts with humans and the foodstuff that humans eat in order to lead to a much larger outbreak than we've ever seen. So these are the questions that we've now started asking. We're doing some specific work on the cases in Kebbi, in the northwest, and so far it doesn't look like that the virus again is different. So what again is changing in the environment? We've always made a lot of assumptions on Lassa, why transmission happens. You read a lot of texts about bush burning at certain times of the year that pushes rats out of the forest and more into places where people live, and therefore there's an increased likelihood of contact with humans, and those have shaped our response strategies. But now we need to do a little bit more work to move from anecdotes to science in terms of really understanding what the conditions are that lead to this increased transmission. My second case study is on monkeypox. Monkeypox is a disease I never heard about in medical school, and I don't know how many people here did when they went through medical school. So in late 2017, when we were notified of a cluster of cases of a bizarre illness, as it was called at the time, in Bielsa State, like you, I went to Google and I went to medical microbiology textbooks to look at what could cause a skin rash, as radical as what we were seeing at the time. But with a combined effort of many people, we quickly And that's one good thing you can do now that is would have been a little bit more difficult 20 years ago. It's not that difficult to get knowledge and gain knowledge on whatever you want to fairly quickly. And we did this in a few weeks. Literally, we sent a team to Bielsa. From the pictures, from discussing with experts, we're already fairly sure that this is most likely to be monkeypox. At the time, we didn't have any diagnostic capacity in Nigeria, so we sent samples to our colleagues in USCDC, and this came out on the 13th of August, confirmed to be monkeypox by PCR. And with that, we put in place measures to prevent further transmission, ensure sample collection and testing, and led to a big outbreak at the end of that year. No outbreak has led to more public anxiety in the last 3 years than monkeypox, basically because of probably how scary it looks and the ease also with which images can be shared these days on WhatsApp and social media. And very quickly, everybody became a doctor diagnosing WhatsApp and diagnosing monkeypox and proposing all sorts of treatment options and solutions. So we had two big challenges during that period. One is responding to a completely new disease in our context, but secondly is managing the incredible media infodemic, as it's called these days, of how do you respond to people in such a politically fragile country where everything is ascribed to some ill intent here or there. So we had to carefully reassure the public that this was an infectious disease, and this is what we're doing about it, and it wasn't one group or the other trying to kill the other group or the other with a bioweapon. But why I say this, it's as important for monkeypox last year as it was for anthrax when it started circulating. For each of these infections that can be seen, real or perceived in one way or the other, you have to learn to deal with both the problem itself and the perception thereof. So my final thesis is, with all of these events, we need a National Public Health Institute that will support the work of all of us and the work that we're doing. And my vision for the Nigeria Center for Disease Control is really to be a resource to states, to local government, to research institutes, to partners abroad, to come to us and work with us to serve collaboratively. We are now very clear in our minds that our primary clients are states. If the states are confident about the support that we can provide, then we probably would have succeeded in winning over the hearts and minds of Nigerians. So our mandate is no different from any other National Public Health Institute, basically to prevent, detect, and control diseases. Our mandate at the moment is limited to communicable diseases. And we do this through coordination of surveillance, supporting states in small outbreaks. We lead the response to larger outbreaks. We maintain a network and support public health labs. We coordinate, collate, and synthesize research to inform policy and coordinate Nigeria's compliance with the international health regulations. So the first of that is terms of prevent. How do we do this? We try and maintain a very active communications platform, so we inform Nigerians of risk, we inform healthcare practitioners. We have guidelines now for mostly all the epidemic-prone diseases in Nigeria. We've adapted and made sure that all our guidelines are both science-based, evidence-based, but also adapted for our specific context. We probably have the most advanced guidelines for the diseases that are most common to us, like Lassa fever, monkeypox, and we're now working with WAHO to make sure that those guidelines are made available to all other West African countries, or at least they have those guidelines to adapt to their own context, just like we did for ours. We're trying to work with the private sector a bit. During the Ebola outbreak 2014-15, almost every big corporate Nigerian organization was asking, how can we help? Well, Ebola has come and gone, and to get $2 out of a private oil company in Nigeria for public health is like pulling out teeth. So it's very difficult to get the private sector to invest in things that they might never need. So, but we are pushing hard. and working hard to see that we have the resources to fulfill the mandate of prevention. And if you look up on our website, you'll see as much material on all the diseases that are common to Nigeria. In terms of detection, this is probably what the biggest deficit that we had 3-4 years ago. It's pointless having a surveillance system that reports thousands of suspected cases if you don't have the capacity to confirm what they are. And this is also an area that there's no magic bullet. You can buy as many PCR machines as you like. If you don't have the expertise, the skills, the persistence to develop the human resources to do this, no machine is going to tell you what you have. So we started working with the centers that had this expertise, especially in Irua for Lassa. And since then, we've built up a number of other centers across the country that now have the capability to make this diagnosis and drive the response. The next question we're beginning to ask is if a lot of the cases that were detected as Lassa, we never went further to find out if it's not Lassa, what are they? So now there's an effort to expand the diagnostic spectrum of what is causing fever in these cases that are suspected to have Lassa. So there are many efforts around strengthening our laboratory architecture in Nigeria. We just finished the National HIV Survey, the biggest HIV survey ever conducted in the world, led on by NACA and the Federal Ministry of Health. But the fallout for that is we have hundreds of thousands of samples now stored in a biorepository. And we're now going to use these samples that were collected for HIV to study the prevalence of other important infectious diseases in Nigeria, therefore creating a win-win situation for all of us in terms of understanding the burden of infectious diseases in Nigeria. So this is just a slide of various labs across the country that have expertise in different things. But what we're doing now is pulling them together, meeting, agreeing standard SOPs, and none of this is easy in Nigeria. To get consensus over a single item, you cannot decide to just do it in a small group. You have to bring everyone together, whether they contribute or not. At the end of the day, if they're not part of the meeting, they say this doesn't affect us. So you have to pull people together to build consensus around approach. A very tedious process sometimes, so it's been a bit slow, but we have done that for many of our epidemic-prone diseases and now moving to the less common ones. The second area in terms of detection is in surveillance. So 3 years ago, surveillance basically happened in Nigeria by you collate at the health facility level, 1 week later you send to the local government level in Excel, 1 week later you send to the state, and 1 week later you send to national. So even in our best case scenario, data came to us way too late to do anything. So we've spent the last 2 years implementing a new digital system for surveillance called SORMAS. It's been rolled out in 14 of our 36 plus 1 states now, which really enables digital access, online access of data from data once it's reported at the local government level through the state to national in real time. And once we get this working fully, we'll be much stronger in our ability to detect, because this will then be connected to our network of labs as well. So our final point is, if you have all of this, you still then have to have the capability of responding. So what we've done over the past 3 years is set up an incident coordination center and emergency operations center in Abuja, but we're also working with states to implement this fairly aggressively. We've covered 16 states. Our goal is to have an EOC in every state in Nigeria by the end of the year. It might slip a bit into the first quarter of next year, but right now we've commissioning in Ogun State has just been completed last week. We hope to commission, and we're just starting Kwara this week. So we're really aggressively moving to have a center in each state where people can come together, decide on their public health priorities, decide on action and response activities, and be able to plan their own response. Lots of things that I won't go into detail. Warehousing and emergency commodities. It's a big challenge. We've been sure that throughout the latter response in the last 3 years, no center has run out of personal protective equipment in Nigeria. This is an incredibly difficult feat to attain because the turnover, the use of this is consistent, and sometimes, you really have to sweat to make sure that every treatment center has the PPEs they need to treat patients. You have to manage, the PPEs at least don't have a narrow shelf life. For things like IV ribavirin, you really have to really think how much do you procure at a time to ensure that you have supplies in real time to patients. So we're learning a lot. Supply chain I thought was a simple thing, but it's actually a very complex science in order to get right, to have the amounts you need at the right place at the right time. It's not a simple thing in a country of 200 million. So this is really my last slide. I'll conclude by saying I hope I've shared some of my, with some examples, the challenges that we face in Nigeria, what we're doing about it, and why a National Public Health Institute is important to serve you, to serve all of us, and to keep us safer. Threats of infectious disease caused by climate change, biological weak onset, and whatever else, wherever they're coming from. The threat itself, nobody will say the threat is not increasing. A public health event can go from local to global very quickly. Nothing demonstrates this more than monkeypox. In the last year, we've had 3 exports of quote-unquote, or let's say cases of monkeypox with a travel history from Nigeria. 2 in the UK, 1 in Singapore, 1 in Israel. Now, each of these we've managed very closely with the sister National Public Health Institute in that country, which has enabled us to learn more. But, the example I keep saying, we're lucky because this is monkeypox. It looks a lot worse than it is, but it could be any other thing. And if there's one lesson we must learn, is travel is very fragile, and any event can spread very quickly. And to global health security, everyone talks about global health security like it's something high up there. Global health security is ultimately how well you do local health security. It is our ability to manage that small case of cases or cluster of cases somewhere in Nigeria that will assure global health security. There's very little global governance, there's no global president, there's no global National Public Health Institute. So whatever we want to do about global health security will depend on the work that we're doing here around surveillance, workforce development, and all the people that we need to do this. So thank you very much for sparing me a few minutes. I wish all of us a good time in Abuja for our visitors, and for those of us, and also for those that have come from all our other states. And we look forward to interacting further during the course of this conference. And thank you again for Professor Abayomi and his team for keeping this on the agenda over the past few years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another round of applause for Dr. Chikwe Ihekweazo, the DG Nigeria Center for Disease Control. Thank you for the work you do to keep us safe and healthy. In the course of his presentation, the representative of the Director of Climate Change in the Ministry of Environment, Mrs. Rukayat Mohammed, walked in. Please wave so that everybody will see you. Okay, thank you and welcome. I understand you'll be making a presentation tomorrow. Okay, all right, thank you. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Nahid Badelia to make a presentation on a changing anatomy of Ebola outbreaks, implications for improving standard of care, and clinical research outcome. But before she makes the presentation, I'd like to introduce her to you. She's an infectious diseases physician and the medical director of Special Pathogens Unit at Boston University School of Medicine, a medical unit designed to care for patients with highly communicable diseases. She oversees the medical response program for Boston University's maximum containment biosafety level 4 program at National Emerging Infectious Diseases Laboratories. During the West African Ebola epidemic, Dr. Nahid served as a clinician in several Ebola treatment units, working with the World Health Organization and partners in health. She currently serves as the clinical lead for the Joint Mobile Emerging Disease Intervention Clinical Capability Program, which a joint US-Ugandan effort to create clinical research capacity to combat viral hemorrhagic fevers in Uganda at the border of DRC. She serves on national and interagency groups focused on medical countermeasures, the intersection between public health, preparedness, research, and clinical care for emerging pathogens. Her research focuses on identification of safe and effective clinical interventions and infection control measures related to viral hemorrhage, fevers. She has served as a subject matter expert to U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Department of Defense, Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, and the World Bank. We are honored to have you. Please put your hands together. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The honor is actually mine. I just want to thank the organizers for having me. And I do have two bones to pick with you, though. You put me after this wonderful panel of speakers all morning, and I am the only thing between you and lunch. So I will try to be as concise as possible for the rest of the time. But as was mentioned, I work for the Needle, which is one of the BSL-4 laboratories that Dr. Abayomi mentioned this morning. One thing that one of his slides said that I'm sure you guys noticed was biosecurity, recolonization of Africa. And it's interesting whether you work in Uganda, Sierra Leone, or Nigeria, this question of how do we do research responsibly is an important one. And I, for one, think we as the global health security community and the research community have to understand that where we start is where we end. If we do not start with equitable research, with gain sharing, we'll end up in situations where we may have the medical countermeasures, but how do we earn the trust of the populations where those medical countermeasures may be deployed? So I'll start with that. I'll also say, I'll point out that a lot of my perspective is from a clinician's perspective, from a bedside perspective. So it's a much more micro level insight into some of the problems that we've seen this morning. So I want you to excuse me for that. It probably tends to get a bit more technical as well. Similar to what Dr. Chikwe was saying, I wasn't sure of the population of the audience, and so I will try to be as non-technical as possible while giving you two aspects. So as was mentioned, I'd worked in Sierra Leone, and I currently work in Uganda at the border of DRC, which is in a unit called JMedic, and the very purpose of this is preparedness, is starting over at a place where you create a center of excellence that can do clinical research and provide good standard of care to patients with viral hemorrhagic fevers. So what I will do is I'll take some of the experiences that I faced along with hundreds of healthcare workers in West Africa and say, how has that gotten better this time around in DRC? What lessons did we learn from the 28,000 patients and the 11,000 deaths that we saw in 2013 to 2016? And then talk about some of the challenges that are still ongoing for the current outbreak. It's a different type of outbreak. It's a different set of challenges. And even though we have new tools, we're now realizing that other things, not just the virus, can complicate our response. So just going back, as you know, the West African Ebola epidemic was a wake-up call for anybody who works in emerging infectious diseases, anybody who works in global health security. This big change from looking at localized outbreaks of Ebola virus disease or viral hemorrhagic fevers to having an entire event that took the lives of almost 11,000 people was a big impact on the way the world thinks about approaching these problems. Any outbreak that's local can be global, as Dr. Chuk was saying. But And Dr. Ayabomi talked about some of the challenges about why that outbreak became an epidemic, right? I want to give you a bit more granular perspective of why that outbreak became an epidemic. And that's the perspective from inside the Ebola treatment units. It was mentioned that there was a dearth of human resources, and I'll say a little bit more about that. By the time that, some of the foreign medical teams, including myself and others, came to help out in Sierra Leone, we're talking about communities with already poor sort of representation for medical care who had lost their healthcare workers due to this epidemic. By August 2014, the first time I was deployed in Kenema, Sierra Leone, we had 100 Ebola patients and about 4 MDs and about 8 nurses taking care of 100 Ebola patients. So let me give you the inverse. In Emory, they had 1 patient and 100 healthcare workers. So when we talk about the survival of Ebola patients, we have to take a look at the standard of care, particularly because the standard of care also helps us decide the effectiveness of the medical countermeasures that we deploy. If we cannot control the standard of care for the patients, we cannot actually figure out if a drug works or doesn't work. So we were seeing about 100 patients, and as opposed to, this is an audience that probably has a lot of experience with viral hemorrhagic fevers. You know what Lassa fever looks like. You know what Ebola looks like. Ebola doesn't look like what it looks like in the movies. Ebola patients look like cholera patients. Less than 20% of my patients had any hemorrhagic features. But because they look like cholera patients, they have similar needs. They lose a lot of fluids. And for the clinicians in the room, you know that means that they require fluid resuscitation. They need IV fluids, good supportive care. So if you're spending only 2.5 hours or 2 hours in your personal protective equipment, like the one on the left, and you have 100 patients, and I can tell you from Emory's experience, these patients need about 10 to 12 liters of fluids per day. How many of my patients do you think I gave 10 to 12 liters of fluids? So the mortality, which was 60 to 70% in most Ebola treatment units, was driven by the standard of care and the limits of the PPE. The other aspect was the delay in diagnostic results. Dr. Bayomi talked about the structure of the Ebola treatment unit. If you remember, he talked about the suspect ward and the confirmed ward. I'm just going to tell you what it was like being inside those units. You're a patient who comes in who likely may have malaria, as likely as you might have Ebola. And so there you are, sitting around in the suspect ward without any personal protective equipment on, around other people who may go on to have Ebola. And in Sierra Leone, at least, towards the worst months of that epidemic, it took 3 to 4 days sometimes to get your results. That is the reason that epidemic continued. The delays in diagnostic results, the lack of sort of clinical laboratory support to do the basic clinical care that we would provide to any other patient with diarrheal diseases. We had poor data quality. People talk about, it looks like mortality didn't change towards the end of that epidemic, despite the fact that there were so many more people, there were so many more Ebola treatment units. Well, I can tell you, for someone who was working during some of the worst months of that epidemic in the summer of 2014, there was no data fidelity. The ability to gather good data during those worst months of the ETU, I think, made it very hard for us to truly get a sense of what the mortality and morbidity was in our units. We had poor inability to control infection control, and of course we had a lack of effective treatments until towards the end of that epidemic, when we really ramped up some clinical trials, and really the only thing that came out of it was the RVSV vaccine, which is currently being deployed, that I'm going to talk about briefly. So this is a new challenge. As Dr. Abayomi talked about, the 5th fake was just declared in DRC for the current Ebola epidemic, the outbreak there. And the challenges here are slightly different. You're looking at a geographic area that is as much driven by the political unrest as with baseline distrust, of the medical system, and particularly for those who are coming from outside the region. So as of July 28th, you're looking at about 2,671 cases and 1,790 deaths. And for those who probably did that calculation in their head, that's 67% mortality still. So how is it possible that we have a vaccine, we have 4 medical countermeasures that I'm about to tell you about, and we still have a mortality of 67% for this disease? To give you an idea, the expats, or some of the foreign medical responders who were taken back to Emory in the United States, the mortality was about 18% in that population. So what are some of the factors that are still driving the mortality in this outbreak, and what does that mean for our future research, clinical research in this area? The other things that I'll mention is that in some ways, this is a more prepared response. In DRC, there are currently 8 laboratories doing Ebola virus disease diagnostics, with GeneXpert mainly as the main one. Same thing in Uganda. All the suspect cases are being tested by GeneXpert. There are 14 operational Ebola treatment units and transit centers, and there's 79 million border screenings. So for someone who works in Uganda at the border of DRC near Kasese, I can tell you there's a Kasese market, who some of you might be aware of. About 12,000 people cross every day during that market day by midday. So this actual challenge and the burden in terms of managing this outbreak is really, it says a lot about the preparedness and the energy that the governments of both DRC and Uganda and Rwanda have put into this. So some of the things that have improved that I'm going to talk about briefly is, I think we are improving the clinical standard of care. Here's how we're improving it. Dr. Abayomi talked about what Ebola treatment units have looked like. One thing that I mentioned to Dr. Chikwe yesterday was, after I took care of those patients in 2014, I went back and I read the WHO bulletin from 1976, taking care of the first Ebola patients that were recognized. And I can tell you that the care that we provided in West Africa was the same as what was provided in 1976. The standard of care for Ebola had not improved by 2013, 2014. In DRC, I believe it has improved, and here are some of the ways how. One, we've changed our imagination in terms of how ETUs, or Ebola treatment units, are actually designed. You'll see that newer ETUs that are being deployed in DRC are those that are inverting the need for PPE. So you have the patient inside. Here is an example of something called a cube that Alima is using. You have patient inside the biocontainment, and you still have to have healthcare workers go in PPE to perform some procedures, but a lot of supportive care measures can actually be done from the outside, which improves two things. It improves the clinician's bedside time, so you can actually provide better supportive care. And it improves patient trust, because families can actually see their loved ones inside these cubes. In sites that are not using Alima's cube or similar things, they've also designed ETUs in such a way that the fourth wall is actually a clear plastic wall. And it still allows administration of oxygen, of other measures, but you still have a wall where patient families can walk in without having to put on full PPE and see the patients. So that reimagination, I think, is something that is improving standard of care. The other thing that's improving standard of care is this a much more sort of ambitious 2019 WHO optimized standard of care guidelines that were put out. And the few things that I think that these guidelines do, which I think is reflected in the kind of care that's being provided in many of the ETUs in DRC, is it improves the provider-patient ratio. It says you can't have more than a certain number depending on the severity of disease, and I think I want to say it's 1 provider for 4 patients or something. It's quite ambitious for critical care for these patients. And it actually talks about aggressive shock management. For the first time, we're talking about not just do we give IV fluids or not. We're talking about how do we safely give vasopressor support. For clinicians in the room, you understand these are pharmacological drugs that we sort of help keep the blood pressure up of patients, and how do we do it safely? And I think that this is actually quite ambitious, and it's working. They're putting in central venous access, central lines into these patients, and doing it safely. They're really pushing the envelope for renal and pulmonary support. So we're still not intubating most patients, we're still not giving people dialysis, but short of that, there's use of new technologies. There's use of temporizing measures. There's use of sort of clinical protocols that allow people who are getting sicker with their disease to still get the kind of care that they need. The last part is I think it's really sort of promoting the use of imaging. Ultrasound is being used a lot more commonly, and it's promoting the use more commonly of laboratory testing, clinical laboratory testing, beyond just Ebola diagnostics. Is talking about using electrolytes. One thing that they've noticed in patients in DRC is there's a marked hypoglycemia, low sugar. These patients are losing their sugar levels, and every few hours you check them, their sugars are falling, and that could be a major cause of death as well. So use of new technologies to look at both imaging as well as labs has been sort of promising. The other thing that's changed is reimagining how we provide care for these patients. I mentioned about the J-Medic unit that we're working on, but I think a similar sort of conversation is ongoing both in both in DRC as well as in Uganda, which is let's not make makeshift Ebola treatment units. Let's talk about permanent structures. Let's talk about centers of excellence where you have healthcare workers where this is one of the main trainings that they get. And so you've created comfort among healthcare workers, and I'll talk about why this is important, but no matter where you go, and I do the same type of work in Boston, in other parts of the United States, in Uganda, in West Africa, and I can tell you as another healthcare worker, fear is one of the major drivers of how much care we were able to provide in those units. We manage that fear. We try to sort of, balance our safety with the patient's survival, but if we can improve training among healthcare workers, that decreases fear and actually improves the patient care that we provide. And so our unit is an integrated unit with the Ministry of Health and the National Ebola Response, and it serves as the healthcare worker unit for Uganda. And what we've done is we've created a staff of about 27 to 28 Ugandan healthcare workers who have been this is their unit. They've been running this for the last 3 years, who basically are now serving as trainers for everybody else in country who are working to create more permanent structures. And the basis of this is to really just create a place where you can do good granular clinical monitoring. You can see, what vitals look like more commonly. You can visualize the patients with video technology as well as with open layout for our Ebola treatment units. And the other thing that we've done is we've really pushed the envelope, which is very much aligned with the new WHO optimized standard of care, with the kind of care that we provide to our patients. And you can sort of see some of the things that we're doing in terms of high level of care at our unit in Fort Portal. So just going back one more. So we have all these things, and we have a ton of new medical countermeasures and vaccines. So what is the latest on the treatments and the vaccine use there? One thing that we noticed at least as clinicians in Ebola treatment units in West Africa was the use of just random medical countermeasures. Couldn't tell you whether they worked or not, because compassionate use, data collected from compassionate use can only go so far in helping prove the efficacy of a drug. And so this mechanism, which I'm sure many of you are already aware of, the MURI mechanism by WHO, was an innovative way of making drugs available, experimental medical countermeasures available to patients in DRC, while still being able to collect information about the drug, at least in terms of safety and in terms of response. So it's not as good as a randomized controlled trial, but it allowed around 700 people to gain access to these 4 medical countermeasures. The NIH and the Biomedical Research Institute of DRC then actually launched a randomized controlled trial as of last fall, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about. But these are the 4 drugs that have been used both in the randomized controlled trial and in the MURIs. A lot of detail here, but I'm just going to point out a couple of things about it. There are 3 monoclonal antibodies on here, and there is 1 antiviral drug. The 3 monoclonal antibodies on here, the only one that has some sort of trial data was ZMapp, which was used in a trial in West Africa, and was not able to prove a statistically significant difference in mortality, but still gave enough sort of data where I think most clinicians said, can we maintain a clinical equipoise? Which means, can we still say it's better, just as good to not give ZMapp as to give ZMapp? And that really was what drove DRC to use ZMapp as part of the control arm, rather than having one placebo-controlled arm and then everything else being a medical countermeasure. And so you have remdesivir, which was an antiviral, which has been used in compassionate use in the past, and it's got very good activity, not just against the current Ebola Zaire strain, but actually pan-Ebola virus species, as well as Marburg potentially. And then ZMapp, and then Regeneron monoclonal antibody, and then MAB114. The differences between these, aside from the type of drugs that they are, is also what kind of supply chain they need. what kind of cold chains they need to manage them, and that's actually affected what drugs people can access within DRC depending on what ETUs they're in. So if you're in an ETU that can't manage on-site cold chain to be able to get ZMapp, this might be a bit more difficult to get access to this. So as of last week, and this number has actually changed, the randomized control trial in DRC has enrolled over 600 patients. I think it's more closer to 650 now, and their total size is actually 750. So they're actually close to getting the full number of sample size. And what we're hoping, the only way that this would be helpful, the way that this RCT will be helpful is if at the end of the 750 patients, they saw one drug that was particularly more effective than everything else. If it comes out that the mortality is kind of the same across the board, I think it will be a lot more difficult for countries to make a decision of what drug to prioritize access to, particularly given sort of some of the supply chain and cold chain issues that I talked about. So they had to, in the last DSMB, the Data Safety and Management Report, the interim evaluation, they had to increase the sample size because they couldn't tell the last time around. So we're hoping at 750 there might be something else. They've also noted the ZMapp shortage, which has kind of plagued the RCT a little bit, which is one of the monoclonal antibodies that I've talked about. And then I mentioned some of the logistics challenges as well. So we'll see. We'll both hold our breath until next week, I think, or 2 weeks from. So this week is when they'll finish enrollment, and I would imagine 2 weeks from now is when we'll hear something about the results. Here we go, vaccine update. So the vaccine that's currently being used in DRC is something called the recombinant vesicular stomatitis virus vaccine that's against the glycoprotein of Ebola. It is a live attenuated vaccine, but live attenuated as in the VSV part is live attenuated. It's just a non-replicating protein of the virus. 178,000 people have received this vaccine. In Guinea, there was a trial during the last epidemic that proved at least trial efficacy of over 95% in use of patients who may have been exposed to Ebola. And in June, the DRC's National Ethics Committee actually did something that was, I think, quite brave and probably the right move in this situation. In the trial in Guinea, pregnant women and children under 5 were not included. So the National Ethics Board actually listened to a lot of concerns, that were coming from both the community as well as the medical response about inclusion of pregnant women and children. So this is a hard decision, right? If you don't know how this vaccine reacts in children and pregnant women, there's a safety issue. But what's the balance between that safety issue and the idea that this disease is actually even more, the mortality is even high in children under 5 and in pregnant women. So the inclusion of that was something that was new, and we'll probably get a bit more data on that. And the other thing that's happened is there's been a shortage of the Merck VSV vaccine. And at some point over the last spring, the SAGE, the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts at WHO, suggested altered dosing. They were half the dose of our VSV, and that seems to be just as effective, and that's what a lot of folks are getting. They also suggested new strategies in terms of how to give the vaccine rather than just giving it to contacts, which is what was happening in the Guinea trial and some of the earlier parts of the DRC outbreak, the current DRC outbreak. They suggested doing pop-up vaccinations and geographic vaccinations in response to the fact that you can't potentially access people all the time if there's conflict, if there are logistics, geographically sort of more difficult and remote areas to reach. So they talked about the fact that you could just go into an area where you know there's going to be a high risk of sort of expansion and provide vaccination deployment there. And there is an ongoing discussion, as many of you may be aware, of deploying a second candidate vaccine, which is Johnson & Johnson's chimp adenovirus 3 vaccine. So there's a bit of a controversy about this vaccine, partly because it's probably a bit harder to deploy because it's got 2 doses. The booster is 1 month later, and the question is how do we get the logistics of it organized to be able to get that deployed. But proponents of the vaccine actually talk about the fact that there might be a longer immune response to this vaccine compared to the RVSV. Thankfully, I'm not in a position to comment on that because I'm not one of the scientists that developed it, so I can say I don't know, and we'll see. So RVSV, the good news is though that the RVSV vaccine, Merck has come back and said that they will be able to increase the doses of it, so there should be more available. So regardless of the strategy that DRC deploys, I think there will be vaccines available for increased vaccinations. 2 more minutes, got it. So is the vaccine that's currently deployed, does it work? This is from April 2019. This is one of the only reports I've seen from WHO in terms of the efficacy of the RVSV vaccine. Very small text, but the only thing you need to know here is that they say that in patients of the 100,000 people who had gotten the vaccine at that point, for symptoms, for those who got the vaccine less than 10 days after, for those who were exposed less than 10 days after getting the vaccine, there were 56 people who were in that group. But for those who actually got the vaccine and weren't exposed likely for 10 days after the vaccination, the number was much smaller. That means if you give the immune system time to sort of build up the response, it seems like the efficacy might be pretty good. The WHO group did a training in Uganda, and Janet Diaz, one of the treatment sort of gurus for the WHO, mentioned one thing that I thought was very promising. She said, no healthcare workers who received the vaccine more than 10 days before an exposure have gotten sick in DRC. And that's really great news for building sort of trust and confidence in patients here. So the things that I think are missing, we're doing a great job of healthcare worker training, but this was I was in Arua, which is at the border, it's in Uganda, at the border of South Sudan and DRC about a month ago. And so we were doing trainings up there, and this was one of the units that was getting ready to get suspects from DRC into Uganda. And when they had suspects, 16 out of the 20 people that they had trained didn't show up for work out of fear, out of sort of the normal things that you would talk about that face healthcare workers and their concerns for safety. And so when I sat down to talk to a lot of them, the reasons that they had were things that you and I would worry about. Do I go back to my family if I treat these patients? Does the vaccine work? What is the efficacy of this vaccine? Right? So I think we still have room to sort of build the training of healthcare workers. I think we still have to answer the security question in DRC and talking about bringing people to care earlier. One of the things that the RCT folks, the randomized controlled trial folks, have mentioned is that majority of the people are not coming in until day 6 of their illness. That's pretty late, right? Day 6, you're already developing severe shock-like syndromes if you follow the normal sort of route of this disease. And there's, I think, a concern for prolonged alert fatigue in Rwanda and Uganda and South Sudan if you keep having to expend all that energy, and by the way, at the cost of every single other outbreak and infectious disease that impacts that region. You're going to have, over time, depreciation in preparedness. And so you're seeing that a little bit right now. I also think that there's a move to try to do more than just Ebola testing, which, at this point, we need to expand our ability to figure out what people are getting sick from, not just Ebola. And I think that goes a good portion to not just providing preparedness, but also winning community trust, providing treatment for other things. Measles, cholera, they're affecting that region. And then the last bit that I'll say is what I would like to see personally, my Nahid Bedelia's wish list. We need better occupational health documentation for workers who are working in the Ebola health response. I haven't seen such a document for World Health Organization, but some guidance of what other vaccines national healthcare workers should be getting when they are working in these Ebola treatment units, in this response. What kind of mental health support should they be getting? So use that. I started off by saying I'm a clinician, so I have my biases. So take that as a bias of why I think this is important. So I'll end there. And I just want to thank each of the different teams that I work with. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Do we have questions for her and Dr. Chikwe? Okay, one. All right, we'll start from this end of the room now. One. Excuse me, you were raising your hand. Okay, 2, 3, 4. Nobody from this side this time around. Okay, so let's take Professor Upong first. Where's the mic? Do you have the mic? Okay, please take.
Thank you. Thanks for this beautiful presentation. My question is to Nahid. I wanted to know from your experience how much of infectious disease interaction with non-communicable diseases you observed, and in terms of your own work in the field, what was it like for the under 5 in terms of survival and post-survival for under 5s? Thank you.
Good afternoon. My question is for the Director of NCDC. Please, sir, why is your center only talk to Nigerians on the social media, but the people in my village are yet to understand what the center is doing? Thank you.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Dr. Kolo from Geography Department, University of Maiduguri. My question actually goes to the DG NCDC. When it's not a question, it's actually a comment. When you presented the issue of drivers to infectious diseases, you came up with 3 issues: the agent, the environment, and the host. And I think in Borno State right now, one of the biggest problems we have is with the host communities and the IDP camps. Last month I was in the National TB Conference here in Abuja on the 17th to 18th of July. And one of the issues we observed in the IDP camps is the high rate of outbreak of diseases, especially tuberculosis and cholera. So I think there is a need for the center to also focus that area, the IDPs in the Northeast, as a case study, and see what we can do in terms of reducing the incidences in the host communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My just questions go to the DG NCDC. The comments or clarifications. One, there are a lot of efforts in ensuring that we have a strong laboratory network for diagnosis of emerging infectious diseases. But again, looking at it in larger context, we know that even if we have those big laboratories, diagnosing emerging infectious diseases in Lut, Irua, and the others, I don't know, what efforts is NCDC making to ensure that we have simple public health laboratories within the states that can diagnose some infectious diseases that are not as highly pathogenic, like Lassa, like Ebola, monkeypox. I'm talking of cholera, those that you can do before going forward to do detailed investigation. Sometimes ago, I know the NCDC had this kind of assessment across the country, going to secondary health facilities to assess the laboratory. But we never heard anything at the end of the day. So I don't know what efforts you are trying to do in that area. 16 states now you've completed the EOC, but you didn't, Lagos State, when are you coming to Lagos? Because I know that NCDC normally give us, they say, Lagos, we don't have problem with you. We know you can handle. But when are you coming to the states to also develop our own EOC? And on the final note, I don't know if there is a relationship existing between the NCDC and the National Biosafety Agency. We listened to their presentation, and we could see that clearly the aspect, the human aspect, in terms of biosecurity is not well entrenched in it. So maybe you can give us something on that. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. All very important questions. I think on the communication aspect, I don't think it's fair to say we only communicate on social media. We use all possible means of communication. At the beginning of every outbreak season, we go on live TV, radio, we take our full-page adverts in newspapers. But it's a big country. That's one thing we have to agree on. It's a big country, and we have 3 tiers of government: federal, state, and local government. So what we do is, for the common diseases, we have developed materials. We ask the states to then translate to whatever local languages around. But there's no way, whether we can go from Abuja to every village in Nigeria to share information. So we see ourselves as providers, at least ensuring that the science is correct, accuracy. Then we work with state governments and local governments to take this information down. But in certain areas, once we have an outbreak, the colleagues from Edo can testify, but during Lassa, we have a small cluster of cases of monkeypox in Lagos State at the moment. We're working, we never go to a state and it's NCDC. We work with the state teams, the state DSNOs, the state local government DSNOs, and whatever other human resources they have to respond at all levels, including communication. But really, communication is an area that is really growing in importance in getting the facts right. And I made that example of during the monkeypox outbreak. It's really something that we have to work together. And not just to ensure that the science is right, but try and protect our area of engagement from the political, social, cultural conversations that happen. And focus, say, this is an infection, this is how it happens. And it's important that we do that collectively. I take your point about IDP camps and Borno. Borno is obviously a very tough situation for all of us. We've worked with the states and with the development partners that support a lot of the work there. This year we had a big challenge with measles in Borno generally. But obviously, once you have something like measles in an IDP camp, transmission rates just spiral. So I take your point there, and we will refocus on our engagement on that. For my brother, Dr. Abdul Salam, with EOCs, it's easy. We're waiting for you to identify a location. But we have, because it's Lagos, we have a plan B within the context of the Central Public Health Lab, which you have access to whenever you want to. But whenever we have a state-led infrastructure, we can also set it up. But what we should do is do what we plan to do. Is a training and mentorship exercise on incident management systems, which we're doing in all the states. So I take your point. On the labs, you know that my graph is just that we didn't have too much time. All the labs there are not Lassa labs. Many of them are state public health labs. So the one thing we're doing differently now is that the concept of having a state public health lab that is somewhere separate from everything else is gone. We're trying to encourage that public health labs should be within existing secondary care facilities or tertiary care, whatever you decide, so that the lab workers can work on other things when there are no outbreaks and when there are now. So we'll work with you to identify where. You're right, Lagos State has actually more resources. So sometimes you're actually right, we deprioritize you. But it's not, you are actually our biggest resource in terms of, even when we go to other states to train, we need people from Lagos to join us in supporting the rest of the country. So we will continue working together. So I think I'll pause there for now. My final comment is the work we do is not, there are no simple solutions to the many of the challenges that we face. And there's no one person, one organization with all the answers. I take the point about collaboration with the National Biosafety Agency. We've known about each other. We met last year to talk about work in the different spheres. We've started pushing a lot on the biosafety, biosecurity work around the health sector and labs. And we have very many strong collaborators, some are in the room, that are helping us increase our work in those areas. But we have to work with the National Biosafety Agency to bring the areas that cut across human, animal, a little bit more closer together, especially on the policy aspect. So that's a strong point I'll take away from this. Thank you.
Thank you for your question about the NCDs, the non-communicable diseases with the ETUs, with the Ebola treatment units. So here's the tough part. When you de-link Ebola care from national healthcare systems, when patients come to care, they don't bring their past medical history with them. And so you're left guessing. You're providing them for whatever problem they came in with. And remember, we don't have a lot of diagnostics with us to take care of those patients. Really, it's just electrolytes, some hematology, and then it's just the Ebola diagnostics. And so for the most part, we were left guessing. You know, is this person, do they have fluid overload because they have cardiac disease or heart disease, or do they have fluid overload because we gave them too much fluid? Rare incidents. But we did see a lot of co-infections, other infections that were clear to sort of pick up. And so you might have seen studies that showed that during the Ebola epidemic in Sierra Leone, this study was from Guinea, 80% drop in inpatient hospitalizations. So when the national healthcare system sort of got affected by the epidemic, that meant people who were getting care for tuberculosis, for HIV, ended up coming to Ebola treatment units. So of course we couldn't really admit them there, but they were looking to get the continuation of their treatment. And so we would see a lot of that with patients who were admitted as well as patients who were referred, but we could not admit. In terms of your question for the under 5, I think it's not just the biological, physiological reason for why. Yes, the mortality in under 5 was much higher. So over 42 and under 5 was much higher. And the reasons for why it was higher for under 5 is not just because I think physiologically they can't handle that volume loss. It's also because they can't tell you when they're not feeling well. And if you have so few people in Ebola treatment units, how do you provide the kind of attention, observation, and care that kids need to pick up early signs of shock and manage that? And the other reason is, for a lot of kids, they were in those ETUs alone. They had lost their parents. And so without a primary care provider within the ETU, it was almost a death sentence for most children, particularly with the lack of enough healthcare workers in there to help.
We've had 4 experts. Professor Akin Abayomi, who spoke for Dr. Obadiah Moyo. We had Dr. Chikwe Ihekweazu, Dr. Rufus Ebegba, represented by Mrs. Bello Scholastica, and Dr. Nahid Badelia. Amongst the 4 of them, they've provided a situation analysis of EIDs in Africa, and they've drawn the linkages of other development deficits to the emergence and re-emergence of infectious diseases in Africa. So they've talked about the exponential growth in population, migration, unemployment, climate change, poverty, and all the pressures we have on the ecosystem. We've also heard the response to outbreaks of EIDs, the improvements in the standard of care, the strategies, and also the missed opportunities for containing EIDs in Africa. Also, we've heard the efforts of government agencies in the control of EIDs, trying to contain, and also the advancement the research, that usually feed into the response. That's how we develop vaccines and other strategies. And all of this, when you look at the various issues raised, you continue to see that there are always challenges. There are also advancements that we've made. So the story is not all gloom and doom. The situation could be better. It keeps getting better every day because of the work that you do, because of the work of researchers, because of the work of those who work to keep us healthy and safe. On this note, I will invite the DG of the Nigerian Copyright Commission, because when you talk about all the research that you do, there are also issues around intellectual property rights. There are issues around copyright that need that, and when I saw him in the room this morning, I said, this is very great. It's good to have him, because although he doesn't work in the area of EIDs, but his agency is very critical to the work that research institutes do, to the knowledge produced, and to the intellectual work that goes into all the work that you do. So I would like to invite Mr. John Ohi Asain to come give us his goodwill message. Please put your hands together for him. Thank you. You said 5 minutes, you'll be fine, right?
2 minutes. Thank you very much. This is even more difficult for me now because I'm now the one that will be standing between you and lunch. So now that I'm going to be the buffer, I will just say 1 or 2 things quickly, because I think the organizers have been very kind to make me say something. I thought they just felt pity for me that I was sitting right there and maybe I was lost. But I enjoyed everything I've listened to, and I've said I won't say anything. But if I were to say something from the policy standpoint, I would say that there is need for government to take health issues more seriously, and I'm happy that the agencies responsible already know their mandate, and I see a clear intersection between good governance and quality health delivery. Like I said, I won't say much, but if I were to speak as an IP lawyer, I will also say that there's need to begin to interrogate how the intellectual property system assists the delivery of public health issues, and the need to ensure that the patent system or any of the proprietary rights systems will not in any way work against the delivery of good health to citizens. If I were to say something about copyright, I would have been saying something about how we'll be more than willing to partner with any organization to ensure that our constituencies also understand what this is about. And when you want to do advocacy, we'll have the creative sector that should also be able to send out the messages in a way that the citizenry will understand. Again, I won't say anything, but if I were to say something as a citizen, I would say that for me is enlightening, and I must say thank you to all you health care givers. Thank you for all the researchers, and thank you for the good work you're doing, because I've seen today that when we read in the papers, we often don't remember those at the back end who are making the figures, the statistics not to rise so high. And I'm just imagining if I was a health care worker, how will I be able to confront this? Will I be able to go into those places? Not minding all the suits you wear, I will still be scared if I were to say something. But I would just say that I see here that there's an ecosystem, and like I think Professor Abayomi said, indeed we have here one earth and one health. And everyone must be concerned about the future and the health delivery in our societies and do something to make it better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. The representative of the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Health, Dr. Godwin Ntadon, is in the room. would like you to please speak to us for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Standing on the existing protocol, I don't know if anyone said before I came in. It should have been his pleasure. I'm here representing the Permanent Secretary, Federal Ministry of Health, who would have wanted to be here himself. I must tell you that he has been in the knowledge, he's been aware of this meeting from inception, and his plan was to actually come here in person. But unfortunately, because of exigencies of duty, as he's now the one acting minister and many other meetings, so he has asked me to come here to represent him. And in his speech, he said the goal of the organization is clear: to develop African-led and Afrocentric strategy within an international context in order to effectively address emerging infectious diseases. When I came here and I saw Dr. Chikwe, I knew we are in the right direction. Dr. Chikwe is leading the NCDC, which is the parastatal of the government, doing great work. We are not unaware of the challenges that the issues has posed, the climate change has posed in recent time. We also have a division of climate change in the Federal Ministry of Health. She also conveyed a message that she would have also loved to be here, but unfortunately she has to be in another meeting outside the country. And again, the PAMSEC, acting as the Honorable Minister now said, I should convey to this meeting that his doors are open always for any support and provision of an enabling environment that we require for the organization to move forward. And he's also saying that his ministry, that is the Ministry of Health, is also willing to work with decisions and outcome of this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. We appreciate your offer of support. Get Africa, you heard the representative of the Permanent Secretary. So when next you're having your conference, or if there is anything you require from the ministry, please do not hesitate to contact them. Right now, we will be breaking up for lunch. But before that, we'll like some photo sessions. We'd like to have some photographs of this opening session so that we could have it in the media before the end of the day. And we will have the keynote speakers and the members of the organizing committee to please come up here and let's have a photograph. Thereafter, we'll have all participants come to the stage and we'll take the photographs. In your folders, you have 3 tickets, 3 launch tickets for each day of the conference. Please, when you go into the next room, lunch will be served in the next room. Please hold one of those tickets with you. Lunch will be for 1 hour, so we expect to come back at, it's 1:53, so we expect to come back at 3 o'clock because we won't leave here until like 2 o'clock. So the photographers, are you ready? Cameramen? Okay. Keynote speakers, please come to the stage. Conference organizing committee members, please come to the stage. Please come. Okay, so we have one. Mrs. Bello, please. The representative of the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Health, please come to the stage. DG Copyright Commission, please join them. Professor Bayomi, please come to the stage. Dr. Chikwe. The representative of the Permanent Secretary, Dr. Ntadon. Dr. Ntadon, please come join them. Yes. I suggest you move because of this. Professor Morenike Upong, come now. Okay, thank you. And the keynote speakers, please stay on. We need a photograph of the keynote speakers. Okay, yes. Okay. We have 2 men, 2 women. Fantastic. It's balanced. It's not always that we have that in Nigeria. Okay, so lunch is next door. We are going to make available the soft copies of all of the 4 presentations. You will receive them in your email. So please make sure you have your correct email on the attendance sheets. Please, let's go next door. We'll come back in 1